Recall and observer bias in case control studies. By the end of this session, you should be able to examine critically the effect of recall bias on association between disease and exposure, describe observer bias, discuss steps that can be taken to minimize bias. Recall and observer bias are sources of error when measuring an exposure. What is recall bias? Recall bias occurs when the information provided by the study participants differs according to whether they are cases or controls. This happens most often when the study hypothesis is known. For example, in an investigation of AMD and exposure to sunlight, if the cases know that this exposure can possibly cause AMD, then they may provide inaccurate information on how much exposure to sunlight they have had in the past. Or cigarette smoking. If cases know that smoking is associated with AMD, they may report that they never smoked, when in fact they were an ex-smoker. Or they may report that they smoked less per day than they actually did. In each of these examples, the cases may recall the exposure differently from the controls. The effect of recall bias on the association between exposure and disease. If a case recalls the exposure to be greater than it actually was, this means the association between an exposure and disease is also greater. That is, the odds ratio would be overestimated. Conversely, if a case recalls the exposure as being less than it actually was, this leads to an underestimate of the odds ratio. In this case, the odds ratio is biased towards unity, or 1. When an odds ratio is 1, this means that there is no difference in the exposure between the cases and the controls. What is observer bias? Observer bias occurs when the researchers or examiners know the goals of the study or hypothesis and allow this knowledge to influence their observations during the study. This leads to them collecting data differently for cases than for controls. Observer bias can be minimized by blinding or masking the investigator to the case control status of the participants. However, when masking is not possible, then the information should be collected in an unbiased way. This can be done by rigorous training of interviewers when administering questionnaires, so that they do not guide the answers given by the participant. Quality control of the laboratory results. 2 workers analysing the same samples, or random samples being checked by a reference laboratory. Training of eye health workers carrying out eye examinations, and frequent monitoring. What happens when observer bias is present? Observer bias can result in an over or underestimate of the association with the disease. So either an association will be found when none exists, or the association will be so weakened that none will be found. In summary, the presence of recall bias and/or observer bias will affect the results of the study and can under or overestimate any association found. It is important to have measures in place to avoid or minimize these biases.